please be advised that there is material that will be presented that is not AA conference approved material. We believe that Joe and Charlie clearly state when they present material that is not AA conference approved material. The presentation has been color-coded to better assist you as to the origin of the information.
We don't want to give you the impression, or try to give you the impression, that you can always be 100% resentment-free. You know, God never gave us anything that was bad. It just depends on what we do with things as to whether they turn out for bad or turn out for good. Actually, a resentment, if it's used right, can turn into something that's really worthwhile. For instance, if somebody says or does something to me that kind of hurts my self-esteem, if it causes me to look at myself and see some changes that I need to make, and I go ahead and make the changes, then that resentment can be used for a worthwhile purpose. You know, a good example is, let's say we're all living in the old neighborhood, and all the old houses are pretty well run down. They all need painting. Several of them got broken window panes, torn window screens. My house is no worse than anybody else's, and I'm very complacent about that situation. I go home from work and I sit in the rocking chair on my front porch and I rock and I rock and I rock and I enjoy the evening. But one day I look up and some idiot has moved in across the street. He's out there painting his house. He's fixing the window screens and window panes, makes my house look bad. And I resent the hell out of him for doing that. I say, who in the hell is he moving in here and screwing up the whole damn neighborhood? Now, if I use that resentment right, it'll cause me to become a little bit ashamed of my house. And next thing you know, I start painting my house and fixing the window panes and the window screens. My next door neighbor resents me for doing so. Next thing you know, he's fixing his house up. And after a while, God's got the whole neighborhood cleaned up like it should have been in the first place. That's the proper use of a resentment. But we alcoholics won't use it that way. We'll sit there on our front porch and we'll rock and we'll rock and we'll resent and we'll resent. 30 days later at midnight, we'll go over and burn his damn house down. We'll show him. So you'll never be completely free of resentments. It just depends on what we do with them, as to whether they turn out to be something useful or something that's harmful to us. And in our procedure we followed yesterday, you know, we had that little 5-column chart that we made up basically from the big book. The first 3 columns were page 65 in the blank form. And then the last 2 columns came from a couple of pages later. And in that thing, in column 1, we made a list of all those people, places, institutions, things we resent. And most of us were absolutely amazed whenever we filled those sheets out to see that we had as many resentments as we do. You can only see one at a time in your head. And we're amazed when we put them down on paper and see how many resentments we really do have. For the first time, we begin to realize how much resentment controls and dominates our thinking. We've made a decision to let God do that, and if we've got that many resentments, then the resentments control it and God can't. Column 2. Column 2, we put down the cause of the resentment. And as we filled out column 2, we begin to realize it's not them that we resent so much as what they've done to us that we resent. And that begins to kind of remove names out of the picture. And later on it's going to make it much easier to go through a forgiving process. When we start realizing it's not really the people and the institutions that's got us upset, it's what they've done to us. Very valuable information. Column 3, we put down the part of self that was affected. Realizing that we can't be angry or resentful unless one part of self has been threatened in one way or the other, either the social instinct, the security instinct, or the sex instinct. And we begin to see in the third column certain parts of self really begin to stand out. In one case, a person might be writing in self-esteem practically every time. Another one, we might be writing in material security. Another case, it might be primarily the sex thing. It's going to be a combination of all three. But at least one part of self is really going to stand out and show us the part of self we're having the most difficulty with. Column 3, we learned for the first time where anger comes from. We learned that it comes from a threat to one of the basic instincts of life. And if our relationship with God is right, instincts under control, they can do about anything they want to us, and we're not going to get angry over it. But if our relationship with God isn't right, and our instincts are not under control about anything they do to us, makes us angry. And now that we know where anger comes from, maybe with God's help, we'll be able to do something about our reaction to anger and not have to get so mad and so upset, with much less chance of drinking than we would be otherwise. We learned 3 valuable things just by filling out those 3 columns. We then begin to look at them in an entirely different light. We begin to realize how much time we've actually wasted in resentments. Knowing full well that when we got a good resentment running around in our head, we're pretty well paralyzed from doing anything worthwhile. And we begin to see how much time is actually wasted in the time we devote to the resentments itself. Begin to look kind of dumb to do that. We also begin to see that the worst thing about a resentment is that it blocks us off from the sunlight of the Spirit, and we don't feel good. And blocked off from God, not feeling good, we want to feel better, and we begin to think about that thing that always made us feel better, a drink or two of alcohol. And next thing you know, we become insane, and we end up getting drunk all over again. We went back and looked at those resentments one more time, and we began to realize that the world and the people in it have really dominated us throughout our entire lifetime through our resentments toward them. We always felt that we had it. Nobody told us what to do. We didn't need other people's advice. But we began to realize that other people have controlled and dominated our thinking as far back as we can remember through our resentments toward them. And if they've controlled and dominated our thinking, they've controlled and dominated our actions, and very effectively we've given them control of our lives. We've actually given them the power to kill us through our resentments toward them. We realized that, and it looked so dumb and so stupid. About 95% of those resentments just automatically begin to disappear. And they had to be replaced with something else. And the part of our mind that was occupied with those resentments is now occupied with love, patience, tolerance, compassion, and goodwill. In other words, God's thinking has entered in to take the place of the resentments. The 3 or 4 or 5% of the resentments that were embedded so deeply, we found out we could get rid of those also through prayer. Praying for those people and asking God to give them in their lives exactly what we wanted in ours. The same peace of mind, serenity, happiness, and etc. And we found if we would pray for those people for a minimum of 2 weeks, that one day that we would wake up and that resentment would be gone. And the reason I'm so emphatic on that is because I've used it myself, and I know from personal experience. I had a guy I resented with a purple passion. I was never going to do anything about it. It's one of those that you carry to the grave kind of resentments. And finally began to bother me, and I went to my sponsor, and he said, "Oh, Charlie, you've got to get rid of that resentment." I said, "I don't want to get rid of this resentment." He said, "Well, that's beside the point. If you don't, you're going to get drunk." And in my usual smart math manner, I said, okay, how in the hell do I do that? And he took me to the example that Joe read yesterday. And he said, read this and go home and do what it says. And you'll get rid of that resentment. And I read it and I went home and I got down on my knees, which I very seldom did in those days. And I said, God, I want you to give that son of a bitch everything he deserves. And that's the only prayer I had for him that day. But I prayed the next day, and the next day, and the next day, and somewhere 3, 4, 5, 6 days later, I don't know when, I found myself saying something I really did not intend to say. I found myself saying, God, give him in his life what I want in mine. Give him the same peace of mind, serenity, and happiness I seek for myself. 3 or 4 or 5, 6 days later, I woke up one morning and that resentment was completely gone, never to return. And the irony in the whole situation is it wasn't 30 days later and the guy moved in as my next door neighbor. And we were able to visit at each other's homes back and forth, and we became good friends again. This thing really does work. It just absolutely amazes me. And I think the reason prayer works so well is when you pray for the welfare of another human being. That's one of the greatest expressions of love that one human being can have for another. And love and hate cannot exist on the same plane. As you pray for this other human being, the anger and the hate's going to disappear. And it's going to be replaced with love, patience, tolerance, compassion, and goodwill. Really, really does work. And we've gotten rid of our resentments. Where they used to be, we have love, patience, tolerance, compassion, and goodwill. A very, very positive happening. 1/3 of my store has now been straightened out. I'm in much less chance of drinking now than I was before I started the inventory process. And again, we emphasize you don't have to wait till step 12 to get something out of this. Every action that we take from step 3 on, there will be a positive result behind it. Joe?
This morning we're going to talk a bit about fears, and before we get into that, let's go back to page 18 for a moment. A lot of people, when they're doing their inventory process in the area of the films, they want to psychoanalyze themselves, and as I said yesterday, to say the reason I have all these fears is because Mommy set me on the party chair backwards and all that sort of thing, but we're not going to do that today in the inventory process. What we are going to do, though, is we're going to do what the big book suggested. We're going to find the facts, we're going to face the facts, and we're engaging in a process to accept the facts. And we have to look at those things and the fears and where they came from in order to do that. And the book said earlier, remember, it said when the spiritual malady is overcome, we straighten out mentally and physically. Our spiritual malady doesn't mean just our relationship with God. It means my own moral fiber, my spiritual fiber, if you will, has to be straightened out also. And Dr. Jung said to Roland that ideas, emotions, and attitudes, which were the guiding force of the lives of the people, are suddenly cast to one side. I'm looking at my ideas and my emotions and my attitudes that I acquired over the years that become the guiding forces of my life. And I go back to page 18 because that first paragraph tells my whole story. And it says, an illness of this sort, and we've come to believe it, an illness involves those that balance in a way no other human sickness can. If a person has cancer, all is sorry for him and no one is angry or hurt. But not so with the alcoholic illness. For with it goes the annihilation of all things worthwhile in life. It engulfs all whose lives touch the sufferers. It brings misunderstanding, fierce resentment, financial insecurity, disgusted friends and employers, warped lives of blameless children, sad wives and parents, and anyone can increase the list. In other words, alcoholism is a family illness. If you live with one of us very long, you're going to be affected by it. The children are going to be affected by it in some manner. Normally, it's not good. And I look back into my life and I realize that my dad today, he had an obsession to drink. My mother had an obsession to see that he didn't drink. And I grew up in that. And my dad, we left the farm and went to California. We didn't fit in real good. We come back to Tulsa, West Tulsa, about 3 miles from where Charlie lived. Charlie and I grew up on the same side of town. And my dad got a job as an iceman, and he had a wife and 5 children. That scares me, and I'm fearless. You know, a wife and 5 children to raise and to provide for, and didn't have the educational abilities to do that. So he got a job as an iceman, minimum wages or less. And he'd work 6 days, back-breaking work, carrying ice to people's houses. And on Saturday he'd get paid, and he'd go down by the bootlegger in our area. Didn't have any liquor stores. Went down with a bootlegger and buy him a pint of whiskey to come home to have a drink. And today I believe he deserved a drink after 6 days of back-breaking work. He ought to have had a drink. He deserved one. He needed one. But my mother saw that couple of dollars that he spent on the booze, taking away food from these 5 kids. And she began to raise Cain with my dad. And they fought and they fussed. And of course we know that alcoholism is a progressive illness. And they began to fight more and argue more, and I grew up in this. And I became emotionally affected by their arguments. Of course I didn't know that at the time. And eventually my dad and my mom fought an awful lot. And they throw things at each other, and from time to time my dad pulled out a gun or a knife and threatened her with it and stuff like that. And eventually, when I was about 7 years old or so, he was to tell us kids he's taking our mom out this weekend and he's going to kill her. And they would be gone all weekend, and us kids would be at home. And I was wondering if he was going to do that this time. I believe that he was. And I used to bite my fingernails all the way down to the quick, wondering about whether he's going to do that or not. Very emotionally affected by this situation. Eventually my mother had to have him arrested, though, for alcoholic insanity, I guess. But they arrested my dad, and they committed him to the Eastern State Hospital in Bonita, which is our local nut house. And this is back in 1949. And he was to stay there until you got well. And my dad was locked up in the criminally insane ward for 3 years and 7 months and 13 days. Some of the most formidable years of my growing up time. And my brother and I, not this one, but the other one, Sam, who's dead now, but we used to hitchhike up there and take my dad a couple of dollars and a carton of cigarettes from time to time. And go up into building 3 on the 3rd floor in the back, and with the criminally insane ward. And we saw things back there that nobody is supposed to see, especially not 7, 8-year-old boys. And on the way home from there, I began to get a lot of ideas, emotions, and attitudes which would become the guiding force of my life. And one day, without any help or any thought from anybody, I said to myself, if God, you got to blame it on somebody, right? If God is going to do this to me and to us, then to hell with him. And if I ever get big enough they can't catch me, I'm not going anymore. To church, that is. My mother, by the way, believed in her church and her religion, and she lived by it all her life and tried to instill that in me, but I rebelled at that. I couldn't accept it. Another thought came to me one day was this. If anything good is going to happen in my life, it's going to happen because I, all alone, without any help, made it that way. And I thought that was a very brave attitude on my part. And as time went by, another thought came to me was that it hurts like this to love people. I'm going to quit loving people. It hurts too bad. And I began to push people out of my life and became isolated, so to speak. And I lived my life that way until way after I come into Alcoholics Anonymous. And I thought those were very brave skills on my part. Turns out they're the most fearful skills that anybody could possibly have. And of course I didn't know it. I thought they were brave. But they weren't. They were fearful. I see people today who are just full of fear. You see them in the checkout lines at the grocery stores. They're pushing and shoving, trying to get up ahead of you, and upset because they have to wait a few minutes. Those people are fearful. See, and I recognize them because I used to do that way too. And see, I didn't have any understanding of God. Didn't have any coping skills, and I didn't have any love for other people. So I was in bad shape. I didn't need God, nothing, or nobody before I come to AA. And I didn't have these coping skills. I never did learn how to react. I never did learn how to act, but I learned how to react. And if you threatened me or one of my basic instincts of life in any way, or I even perceived a threat, it was not good for you, because I would react on you, and I would have tried my best to hurt you. In our area of where Charlie and I lived, in our area, there's a lot of fearful people. there was two kinds of people in our school, in my school. And one was the people that ran home from school, and there's another people who ran people home from school. And I knew if they ever got you to running, they wouldn't quit. So I became one of those people who ran people home from school because I was so scared. You see, and I did not know that. Thank God for the inventory process.
They put you in jail for some of those coping skills too, don't they?
Yes, they will. They did that for me. They'll divorce you for that too. They did that for me. See, when I got here, I had the spiritual knowledge of a 7-year-old boy. I had the coping skills of an 8 or 9-year-old boy. And later on, I'll tell you about some of the sexual knowledge I had of an 11 or 12-year-old boy that I learned off the streets from people that didn't know any better about it than I did. Man, you think I would have messed up and I needed an inventory process. And so anyhow, let's go now to page 67. Thank God that we found, or at least I found, an inventory process.
Last paragraph on page 67.
He said, notice that the word fear is bracked alongside the difficulties with Mr. Brown, Miss Jones, the employer, and the wife. This short word somehow touches about every aspect of our lives. It was an evil and corroding thread. The fabric of our existence was shot through with it. It set in motion trains of circumstances which brought us misfortune we felt we didn't deserve. But did not we ourselves set the ball rolling? Sometimes we think that fear ought to be classed with stealing. It seems to cause more trouble. Now we reviewed our fears thoroughly. We put them on paper, even though we have no resentment in connection with them. We ask ourselves why we had them. Wasn't it because that self-reliance failed us? Self-reliance was good as far as it went, but didn't go far enough. Some of us once had great self-confidence, but it didn't fully solve the fear problem, or any other. When it made us cocky, it was worse.
Okay, that last paragraph that Joe just read gives us basically the same set of instructions to review our fears as we had for our resentments, except worded a little bit differently, which is Bill's way of doing things. So to avoid any confusion, we just made up another little sheet. We called it a review of fears, and it looks almost exactly like the resentment sheet looks. So let's take a look at it for just a few minutes. It's got the same 5 columns. In column 1, it says, what do I fear? Now, we men, we're tend to think we're tough and we're macho, and we don't think we have a whole lot of fear. But we're not talking so much about physical fear as we are about all those fears that run through our minds and control and dominate the way we think. And if we really look at them carefully, I think we'll find that the majority of us have many, many different fears. You know, we all have fears connected with our marriages. We have fears connected with our children. We have fears connected with our jobs. We have fears connected with the Internal Revenue Service. We have fears connected with the police department. And I can sit here today and we could just name fear after fear after fear after fear that we human beings have. So all we got to do in column 1 is we just list the people, the principles, the institutions, those things that we have fear connected with them. Always going from top to bottom, just like we did on resentments. Now, when I first started this process, I didn't think I had very much fear. And they came to me and they said, make a list of your fears. And I said, well, hell, I don't have any fear. And they said, oh, well, yeah, surely you got 1 or 2. Isn't there anything you're afraid of? And I said, well, yeah, I'm kind of afraid of snakes. And they said, okay, put it down on that sheet. And I put snakes down, and next thing you know, I thought of another fear, and I put it down, and next thing you know, I thought of another fear. And the next thing you knew, I began to fill out sheet after sheet after sheet with the number of fears that I actually had. I did not think I was a fearful person at all, but I began to realize that I had as many different fears as I had resentments to start with. And for the first time in my life, I began to see how many fears that I really do have. You can only see one at a time in your head. And I don't think any of us will ever see how much fear controls and dominates our thinking until we get them all down on paper and see them in their entirety for the first time. Now, we made a decision to let God direct our thinking. And if the fears direct our thinking, then God can't, and it's just that simple. Column 2. What's the cause of the fear? Now, Joe said we're not going to attempt to psychoanalyze. I'm not going to say that I'm afraid of the dark because Mother set me sideways on the potty when I was 2 years old. Fear, like resentment, we're supposed to have some of it, and it can be used for a worthwhile purpose. Fear brings caution, and caution keeps me from getting hurt and keeps me from getting in trouble. Yeah, I am a little bit afraid of the dark. Why? Well, I don't have headlights and I can't see at night, and that keeps me from getting hurt. I'm a little bit afraid of heights. Why? Well, I don't have wings and I can't fly, and that keeps me from getting hurt. But if those fears should keep me from going outside after dark, if they should keep me from riding in an airplane or an elevator, then I better get them on this paper and look at them very closely, because they are controlling and ruling and dominating my life for me. I find that most of my fears are basically centered about one of 2 or 3 things anyhow. Usually I'm scared to death about something because I'm afraid I'm going to lose something I've already got, or I'm afraid I'm not going to get something I really want, or I've done something I shouldn't have done and I'm scared to death what they're going to do whenever they find out about it. Nearly every one of my fears, there's one of those root causes behind it. Column 2, I just put down the cause of the fear. If I've got a fear that I can't determine the cause, I just put, I don't know. But in most of my fears, there is a root cause behind it, usually concerned with worrying about what I've got, what I want to get, or what I've done nearly every time. Column 3. What part of self is affected? And once again, I can't experience fear unless there's a threat to one of the basic instincts of life. If you threaten my social instinct in any way, that creates fear in me. If you threaten my security instinct, that creates fear in me. If you threaten my sex life, that creates fear in me. And once again, as we fill out the 3rd column, most of us are going to notice at least one part of self is really going to predominate. Maybe our main trouble with fear is we're scared to death of what people are going to think of us. And we keep writing in self-esteem, self-esteem, self-esteem. For another person, the fears might be mainly centered on material security. And we keep writing in security, security, security. Another person, they might be centered somewhere in our sex life. And we keep writing in sex, 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 and sex. Going to be a combination of all 3. But one part of self is going to stand out and show us the part of self we're really having a problem with as far as fears are concerned. For the first time in my life, in column 3, I began to realize where fear comes from. I didn't know where anger came from, and I didn't know where fear came from. I thought it was just one of those feelings that flits into your mind. You could do nothing about it. But today I realize fear is a reaction to a threat to one of the basic instincts of life. And once again, if my relationship with God is right, if my instincts are under control, you can say and do about anything you want to me, and it's not going to create fear. But by the same token, if my relationship with God isn't right, my instincts are not under control, about anything you say or do to me is going to create fear. Now that I know where it comes from, maybe I can do something about that fear with God's help and be in much less chance of drinking than I would be otherwise. I simply did not know where it came from. Column 4. Column 4 says, what did I do, if anything, to set the ball rolling? To set in motion trains of circumstances which are led by being in a position to have the fear. So many of our fears come from we've done something to satisfy one of the basic instincts of life that we shouldn't have done in the first place, and now we're absolutely scared to death of what they're going to do whenever they catch us. Almost invariably we find that we ourselves set that thing in motion. Yeah, I'm afraid of the police department a little bit today. Well, if I would quit exceeding the speed limit, I wouldn't have to be afraid of them. I'm still a little bit afraid of old Barbara. If she ever finds out everything I was doing 34 years ago, she's probably going to file for divorce again. I'm a little bit afraid of the Internal Revenue Service. Well, if I wasn't always trying to cheat on my income tax, I wouldn't have to be afraid of them. Most of my fears, I myself have set those things in motion. Now, the thing that really amazed me is I filled out this fears column. I kept seeing a lot of the same names appearing on the fear sheet that I had on the resentment sheet. Barbara was on both of them. Internal Revenue Service was on both of them. Police Department was on both of them. Former employer was on both of them. I never had tied together in my head how closely the resentments and the fears ran together until I see all those names appearing, many of them, on both sheets. Column 5. Where had I been selfish, dishonest, self-seeking, frightened, and inconsiderate? Which of the above character defects caused me to do what I did, or caused me to want to hold on to the old fear even though I may have done nothing to cause it? And I find in almost every instance as we go across that thing, that in most cases I did something to set it in motion based on my old selfish character, or I stole based on my old dishonest character, or I did something I shouldn't have done through fear based on my old fearful character, or that I did things that hurt other people based upon my inconsideration of others, and now I've got to fear what they're going to do whenever they find me. Same basic character defects causes me to experience the excessive fear, causes me to do the things that cause me to have fear connected to those things in the future. But just think, if I could get a little less selfish, I wouldn't have to be afraid of losing what I got or not getting what I want so much. If I could become a little less dishonest, I wouldn't be lying and cheating and stealing, and I wouldn't have to worry about what people are going to do whenever they catch me. If I could practice a little more courage rather than be self-seeking and frightened, maybe I would have the courage to do some of the things that I needed to do, and maybe I could have the courage to quit doing some of the things that fear caused me to feel I had to do. If I could become a little less inconsiderate, maybe instead of being so worried about what I want and what I need, well, I might start thinking about what other people want and what they need. And I wouldn't have so much fear connected with those things. We treat this just exactly as we do the resentments. Now we're in the process of doing step 4. This is the fears part of it. And once again in the 5th column, we see the exact nature of the wrong we're going to talk about to another human being in step 5. The fear is what blocks me from God. That's the wrong. But what's the exact nature of it? If I wasn't so selfish, if I wasn't so dishonest, self-seeking, frightened, and inconsiderate, I wouldn't have to experience so much fear. So I see the 5th column, what I'm going to talk to another human being about, in step 5. I see the defects of character that I'm going to come willing to turn loose of in step 6. Also in the 5th column, I see the shortcomings I'm going to ask God to take away in step 7. And quite naturally, some of the names on column 1 will be people we've harmed and we're scared to death of what they're going to do whenever they catch us. So as those names come off of column 1, they'll be added to the sheet to be used later on for steps 8 and 9. And when I complete this fears thing, then I've got all the information I need for steps 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, and 9, just like I had all the information I needed for the resentment part. The easiest, most simple thing I've ever seen. Now, also like resentments, if you've got a fear that you don't want to get rid of, knowing full well it might block you off from God, knowing full well it might cause you to get drunk, and you got a fear you don't want to get rid of, for God's sake, we need to put it on a sheet of paper. And we really need to see the truth behind it. Because you see, just like with resentments, we could use fear to rationalize and justify doing things that we really should not be doing. And by the same token, we can use them to rationalize and justify not doing things that we really should do or would really like to do. Let me give you an example. And I'm going to ask you a question. I'm going to ask each one of you to please be honest with me. How many of you this morning in this room would like to go back to school and finish your education? Could I see your hands, please? A whole bunch of you, you betcha. Now I'm going to ask you another question. Please be honest with me. How many of you really intend to do that? Could I see your hands? About a fourth of the hands went up this time. Why? Nothing more than fear. Fear that we won't measure up. Fear of failure. Fear of hard work. Keeps us from doing some things we really would like to do. And when that happens to us, then fear is controlling and dominating our minds and controlling and dominating our lives. All my life I've loved to work with my hands. And I always wanted to build a set of kitchen cabinets. But I never would build a set of kitchen cabinets because I knew there would be a lot of mistakes in them. They wouldn't look too good and people would laugh at me. Well, after several years of practicing this program, one day I gathered up enough courage to build a set of kitchen cabinets. Now, they don't look very good. There's a lot of mistakes in them and people laugh, but I don't give a damn anymore. I don't let fear control and dominate and rule my life for me any longer. You're supposed to have some fear, but not to the extent that we let it control us and rule us and dominate us. Now, as we begin to look at these fears on paper and see the truth behind them, if you think resentments look dumb, just wait till you get all these fears down on paper and look at them. They look good in your head, but you put them on paper and they look double dumb on paper. They really do. And they look so dumb that about 95% of them are going to start disappearing automatically when we see the truth behind them. You know, we think we're reasonable, intelligent people, and we are. And we don't like to look dumb. And we see how we've let these fears control us and rule us. You know, it looks absolutely stupid to us when we see the truth behind them. And most of them are going to disappear just like resentments did. But there's probably going to be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 fears embedded in our minds so deeply, so long, that we're probably going to have a little extra help getting rid of those fears too. Just like we had to have extra help with some resentments. We come to the second prayer in the big book on step 4, Joe.
Charlie reminded me of that story about building those cabinets. I had a friend, or a guy that I sponsored several years ago. His name was Todd. Todd was 29 at the time and been sober in a couple of years. And I said, Todd, what are you going to do with your life? He said, well, I don't know. He was unemployed and unemployable, one of those fellows. Wasn't dumb, he's just that way. And I said, what would you like to do with your life? He said, I'd like to become an engineer. And I said, well, why don't you go to school and become an engineer? He said, well, I don't even have a high school education. I said, well, get your GED and then apply for junior college. He did that, and we got on the Dean's Honor Roll at junior college and got a scholastic scholarship at the University of Tulsa Engineering School. And one of the questions he asked me was, you know how old I'll be when I get out of engineering school? I said, you know how old you'll be anyhow? He called me last year, and he was working for an engineering company in Modesto, and he had one more semester to go, and he would graduate as a full-fledged engineer, all because he got over the fears of going back to school.
You see, the reason we're so enthused about this stuff is we've had the opportunity to see this work for people over and over and over and over and over. Years ago, doing a big book study out in California, had a young fella come up to me after we did this fears thing, and he said, you know, Charlie, I can't even read. I couldn't go back to school. He said, my daddy's taught me that I'm dumb and I'll never be able to learn anything in my life. And he said, after what you just did on that fears thing, he said, by golly, I'm going to go to night school and I'm going to learn how to read. I saw him 2 years later, and he walked up to me and he opened the big book. And he said, would you mind if I read to you out of chapter 5? And he read how it works to me, very, very haltingly. But he'd been going to night school, and he'd learned how to read. I run into him a couple of years later, and he said, I'm going back to college. And he went back to college, and he got his degree. You know, it just blows my mind when I see people do this. But that's why we're so enthused about it, because we've seen this stuff happen over and over and over and over. This thing works. It's so damn simple that it looks like it couldn't possibly work. But I think that's one of the reasons it works, is the simplicity behind it. Had a woman in New York City. We talked about the fears. And she came up to me and she said, you know, I live here in New York City, don't have a car. It's hard to get around anyway except the subway system. And she said, I am scared to death to ride on the subway. I said, why? And she said, well, they're always mugging people and everything. And she said, I just really can't go anywhere anymore because I'm just afraid to ride the subway. And I said, well, you know, there's a solution to that. There's a prayer in the book that you can use to get rid of that fear. And Joe's going to read that prayer just right here in just a second.
It said, perhaps there's a better way. We think so, for we're now on a different basis, the basis of trusting and relying upon God. See, prior to AA, I didn't have any God in my life, but now I do. So now I'm trusting and relying upon the God of my understanding. We trust our infinite God rather than our finite selves. We're in the world to play the role He assigns. Just to the extent that we do as we think He would have us, and humbly rely on Him, does He enable us to match calamity with serenity. Now, we never apologize to anyone for depending upon our Creator. We can laugh at those who think that spirituality is the way of weakness. Paradoxically, it's the way of strength. The verdict of the ages is that faith means courage. All men of faith have courage. They trust their God. We never apologize for God. Instead, we let Him demonstrate through us what He can do. And here's the prayer. We ask Him to remove our fear and to direct our attention to what He would have us to be. And at once, we commence to outgrow fear. My first sponsor, old Franklin, he told me the two most important things about prayer. This was absolutely, he said, the most important things. One was to start, and the other one was to continue. Two most important things about prayer. And as I look back into my life in AA, every time I have prayed, I have changed just a minute amount, hardly noticeable to me or anybody else. The next time I pray, just another little fuzz, and the next time just a little bit more. And as time has gone by, there's been a major change in me because of this prayer factor. I can't heal a sick mind with a thick mind. I can't think my way out of it. Only God can change me. Thank God I know that today.
We hear always about the promises on page 83 and 84. You never hear about the promises. They're spread throughout the entire book. Joe just read one of the greatest promises to be found anywhere in the book. We ask God to remove our fear and direct our attention to what He would have us be instead, and at once we commence to outgrow that fear. I took that lady in New York City to this prayer thing. I said, now you start praying just like the book says. You ask God to remove that fear and direct your attention to what He would have you be instead, and I think you'll outgrow it. I gave her my phone number and I said, call me in 30 days or so and let me know how you're doing. And it wasn't 2 weeks and she called me. And she said, I'm riding that damn subway system all over town. She said, I have no fear connected with it at all anymore. This thing really does work. Fear controlled her. Fear dominated her. Fear kept her from going and doing the things she really wanted to do. She got rid of the fear, and then she was free to go. It really, really does work.
That lady looked like Zaza Gabor and acted like her and had the same accent. We called her Maddie Gabor.
She calls me Charlie Baby. Okay. We got rid of the resentments and they were replaced with love, patience, tolerance, compassion, and goodwill. Now the file cabinet that I had that was filled with all these fears, it's now been emptied out also. And again, the natural law applies. God's not going to allow another hole in my head. I've got enough of them already. Have the fears disappear, they've got to be replaced with something else. And the only thing that'll replace them will be the opposite of the fear. And where my mind used to be filled with fear, now it's filled with faith and courage. And I'm allowed to do many, many things that I never could do before. Just as importantly, I'm allowed to quit doing some of the things that I thought that I had to do. And again, what amazed me is I didn't have to go to any other fellowships. I didn't have to read any other books to find faith and courage. If God dwells within me, and my book says He does, that's always been a part of my makeup. I just never could use it before. In my chase for money, power, prestige, sex, and etc., those things had to be repressed to let me operate on the level that I wanted to operate on. But now that the fear is gone, they automatically come to the surface. I'm in much less chance of drinking now than I was before I started the inventory process. 2/3 of my little store has now been straightened out. The damaged and unsaleable goods have been removed, and good items have come back in their place. But I also had in my store back here a little storeroom that was filled with shame and fear and guilt and remorse associated with the people I've hurt in the past. In order for me to get complete peace of mind, it looks like I'm going to have to do something about that also. And it seems as though we can do nothing about the guilt and remorse unless we actually can see the truth behind it. Same way with resentments, same way with fears. Till we can see the truth, we can do nothing about them. And it seems as though for we human beings, that we seem to hurt each other faster and easier in the sexual area than we do in any other area. You know, we human beings, when it comes to sex, we're a little bit different than the other species here on earth. The other animals, the other species, they have a sex life too. And they have a sex urge also, so they can reproduce themselves too. But the difference in their sex life and ours is they don't have any choice about theirs. They don't have this thing called self-will. And whenever it becomes time for a member of the other species here on earth to reproduce themselves, that's usually done on God's direction and God's time. And God usually signifies that time by some change in the female of the species. The male senses that change. The two join together. And it's kind of like bang, bang, thank you, ma'am. And when it's over with, they normally go their separate ways. You see, they don't think about having sex before they have it. They don't really think about having sex while they're doing it. They can't usually decide who they're going to have sex with. They can't usually decide whether they're going to have it with one or more partners. They can't decide how many times they're going to do it. And they can't even decide what position they're going to do it in. Therefore, you see very few sexual problems amongst the other species here on Earth. I've never seen a cow on a psychiatrist's couch yet talking about sexual dysfunction. Now, we human beings, though, we're a little bit different. You see, God gives us this thing called self-will. And we can have sex any day of the year that we wish to. We can choose who we're going to have sex with. We can decide whether we're going to have it with one or more partners. We can decide how many times we're going to do it, providing we're physically capable of doing so. And we could even decide what position we're going to do it in. They tell me there's something like 64 different positions a human being can have sex in. I have no idea what they are. I only found 3 in my lifetime. And 2 of them damn near killed me. I'm not sure I'm going back to that at all.